Sometimes the hardest choices we make are the ones that save everyone else, but destroy us completely. There's nothing quite like watching everything you've built with your own hands go up in flames, especially when you're the one holding the match. Old Silas Granger lived alone in the mountains with just his dog Boone for company. After years of solitude, he'd found his peace in that little cabin he'd built himself. But when Boone found those strange eggs by the woodpile, everything changed. The eggs were bigger than chicken eggs and warm to the touch. When they hatched 3 days later, what came out wasn't anything that belonged on God's earth. That's when Silas made the hardest decision of his life. But what could possibly drive a man to burn down his own home? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning air carried the scent of pine and wood smoke as Silas Granger stepped onto the weathered porch of his cabin, coffee mug in one hand and his grandfather's walking stick in the other. At 62, his frame still carried the strength of a man who'd spent his life working with his hands. Though silver now threaded through his dark beard, and the lines around his eyes spoke of winters spent squinting against mountain snow, Boone, a blue-eyed shepherd mix with patches of grey and white, lifted his head from where he'd been lying in the morning sun. The dog's ears perked forward as he watched his master's familiar routine, the slow survey of their domain, the careful examination of the horizon where the peaks met the sky in jagged silhouettes. This was their kingdom, small but complete, carved from wilderness and maintained through quiet determination. The cabin itself was a testament to Silas's patience and skill. He'd felled each log himself, using techniques his father had taught him decades ago. The chinking between the logs remained tight after 15 years, sealed with a mixture of clay and moss that kept out the bitter mountain winds. The roof, shingled with cedar he'd split by hand, showed only minor wear despite the harsh weather that battered these heights each winter. A stone chimney rose from the center, its smoke providing the only sign of human habitation visible for miles in any direction. Another fine morning. "Old friend," Silas murmured to Boone, who responded with a gentle thump of his tail against the porch boards. The dog had been with him for 8 years now, found as a pup, abandoned by campers down near the tree line. Silas had nursed him through a broken leg and a bout of pneumonia that first winter. And since then, they'd been inseparable companions in their mountain solitude. The property encompassed nearly 40 acres of steep terrain, most of it too rocky for farming, but perfect for a man who valued privacy above all else. A small meadow behind the cabin provided space for a vegetable garden where Silas grew potatoes, carrots, and hardy greens that could survive the short growing season. A spring-fed creek ran along the eastern boundary, providing fresh water year-round and supporting a grove of aspen trees that turned brilliant gold each September. Silas had chosen this spot carefully when he'd first arrived 20 years ago, fleeing from a life that had grown too complicated, too full of expectations and disappointments. The nearest neighbor lived 12 miles down the mountain, accessible only by a rough trail that became impassable during heavy snow. The closest town, Millerville, was a 2-hour ride on horseback in good weather, longer in winter when the higher passes filled with snow. He'd come here seeking solitude after his wife Martha's death, needing distance from the well-meaning friends and family who couldn't understand his grief. The cancer had taken her slowly, month by agonizing month, until the woman he'd loved for 30 years became a shadow of herself. After the funeral, after the settling of affairs, after the selling of their house in town, Silas had packed what little he needed and headed for the high country. The transition hadn't been easy. Those first winters had tested him in ways he hadn't expected. The isolation that seemed so appealing in summer became oppressive when snow blocked the trails for months at a time. He'd learned to preserve food, to repair equipment with whatever materials he could scavenge, to treat his own injuries and illnesses. More than once, he'd wondered if he'd made a terrible mistake, but gradually the mountains had worked their magic. The silence that once felt suffocating became restorative. The daily rhythms of survival, cutting wood, hauling water, tending the garden, provided structure and purpose. Most importantly, the solitude allowed him to grieve properly, without the pressure to move on or get back to normal that had driven him from civilization. Now, 2 decades later, this place felt more like home than anywhere he'd ever lived. Every tree, every rock formation, every seasonal change was as familiar as his own reflection. He knew which game trails the deer favored, where the best fishing holes lay along the creek, and how to read the subtle signs that predicted weather changes days in advance. His supplies came up twice a year via pack mule, once in late spring when the trails cleared, and again in early fall before the heavy snows began. Old Pete Mackenzie made the journey from Millerville, bringing flour, sugar, coffee, ammunition, and other necessities that Silas couldn't produce himself. In exchange, Silas sent down furs from the animals he trapped, along with payment drawn from the modest inheritance Martha had left him. The arrangement worked well for both men. Pete got fair payment for his services and enjoyed the excuse to spend a few days in the mountains, while Silas maintained his independence without completely cutting himself off from the outside world. During Pete's visits, they'd share meals and conversation, catching up on news from the valley below, but Silas never felt tempted to return to that life. Boone had adapted to their routine with the wisdom that dogs possess. He served as an early warning system for wildlife, alerting Silas to the presence of bears or mountain lions that occasionally wandered through their territory. During hunting season, he helped track wounded game through the thick underbrush. In winter, he provided companionship during the long evenings when darkness fell early, and the cold made outdoor work impossible. The dog had his own personality and preferences. He favored the sunny spot on the south side of the cabin during cold mornings, enjoyed swimming in the deeper pools of the creek during summer, and had an uncanny ability to sense changes in weather hours before they arrived. Silas had learned to trust Boone's instincts, often adjusting his plans based on the dog's behavior. Their daily routine rarely varied. Mornings began with coffee and a survey of their domain, followed by whatever maintenance tasks the season demanded: splitting wood, repairing tools, tending the garden, or checking the snares and fishing lines that supplemented their diet. Afternoons were reserved for heavier work like cutting timber or hunting, while evenings were spent by the fire. Silas, reading by lamplight while Boone dozed at his feet. The cabin itself was spartanly furnished, but comfortable. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, with a heavy wooden table and 2 chairs positioned nearby. Silas's bed occupied an alcove in the back corner, while shelves lined the walls, holding his collection of books, tools, and personal belongings. A ladder led to a small loft, where he stored supplies and equipment. The walls displayed a few mementos from his previous life: a photograph of Martha taken on their wedding day, a military service medal from his time in Vietnam, and a hand-drawn map of the surrounding terrain that he'd created over years of exploration. These items connected him to his past without overwhelming him with memories he wasn't ready to confront. Outside, various outbuildings supported their self-sufficient lifestyle. A smokehouse for preserving meat stood near the creek, while a small barn housed his tools and stored hay for the occasional horse or mule that brought supplies. A root cellar dug into the hillside kept vegetables fresh through the winter months, and a workshop allowed him to repair equipment and craft new items as needed. The rhythms of mountain life had taught Silas patience and acceptance. He'd learned to work with nature rather than against it, to appreciate the changing seasons, and to find satisfaction in simple accomplishments. The man who'd once measured success in terms of income and social status now found meaning in a well-stacked woodpile or a successful hunt. But perhaps, most importantly, the mountains had given him peace. The guilt and anger that had consumed him after Martha's death had gradually faded, replaced by a quiet acceptance of life's unpredictability. He still missed her terribly, still talked to her sometimes during his evening walks, but the sharp edge of grief had dulled to a manageable ache. As Silas stood on his porch that particular morning, watching Boone investigate something near the woodpile with unusual intensity. He felt the familiar sense of contentment that marked his days. The sun was climbing higher, promising warmth despite the crisp air. The garden would need attention soon, and he'd spotted deer sign near the meadow that suggested good hunting ahead. It was a morning like countless others, unremarkable in its simplicity and routine. Nothing in the peaceful scene suggested that this day would shatter the carefully constructed life he'd built, or that the choices ahead would test everything he believed about himself and his place in this remote corner of the world. Boone's sudden bark shattered the morning quiet, sharp and insistent in a way that immediately commanded attention. The dog was pawing at something near the base of the woodpile, his entire body tense with excitement or alarm. Silas couldn't tell which. Silas set down his coffee mug and walked over to where Boone was digging frantically at the base of the woodpile. The dog's behavior was unlike anything he'd seen before. Not the excited digging that accompanied the discovery of a buried bone, nor the cautious investigation he showed around unfamiliar scents. This was something different, something urgent. "What you got there, boy?" Silas asked, kneeling beside his companion. Boone looked up briefly, his blue eyes holding an expression that seemed almost pleading, then returned to his digging with renewed intensity. Silas gently moved Boone aside and began clearing away the loose dirt and debris himself. His calloused hands worked carefully, years of experience having taught him patience in all things. About 6 inches down, his fingers encountered something smooth and warm. He paused, frowning. The morning air was crisp enough to see his breath, yet whatever lay buried here radiated heat, like a stone that had been sitting in summer sunlight. He cleared more dirt away, revealing what appeared to be the top of an egg, but unlike any egg he'd ever seen. The shell was roughly the size of a goose egg, but rounder, almost perfectly spherical. Its surface was a deep amber color, with darker speckles that seemed to shift and move when he looked at them directly. More disturbing was the warmth it gave off, a steady heat that seemed to pulse like a slow heartbeat. Silas sat back on his heels, studying the strange object. In 62 years of life, 20 of them spent in these mountains, he'd encountered most of what nature had to offer. He knew the eggs of every bird species in the region, had stumbled across the nests of hawks, eagles, and even the occasional owl. This belonged to none of them. Boone whined softly, pressing against Silas's leg. The dog's ears were flat against his head, a sure sign of distress or confusion. Silas reached down to stroke the animal's neck, feeling the tension in the muscles there. "Easy, boy. Let's see what we're dealing with here." He continued excavating carefully, discovering that the first egg was part of a clutch of 6, all nestled together in what appeared to be a carefully constructed nest. The nest itself was another puzzle, woven from materials that included pine needles, moss, and what looked like strands of something metallic that caught the morning light with an oily shimmer. Each egg pulsed with that same inner warmth. And when Silas leaned closer, he could swear he heard something, a faint sound like whispered words in a language he didn't recognize. The sensation made the hair on his arms stand up, though he couldn't say why. He'd heard stories, of course. Every mountain man had tales of strange things encountered in the deep wilderness, phenomena that couldn't be easily explained. Most he'd dismissed as the products of isolation and imagination, the mind's way of filling empty spaces with mystery. But sitting here with these impossible eggs warming his hands, those stories seemed less far-fetched. Martha had always been the practical one in their marriage, quick to dismiss his occasional flights of fancy with gentle humor. "Silas Granger," she'd say, "you've got too much imagination for your own good." He found himself wishing she were here now, if only to tell him he was seeing things that weren't there. But the eggs were undeniably real, solid and warm in his hands. As he lifted one carefully from the nest, it seemed to pulse more strongly, as if responding to his touch. The surface was smoother than any eggshell should be, almost glass-like. Yet it didn't feel fragile. Boone had backed away several feet and was now watching with his ears pricked forward. head tilted in the manner of a dog trying to make sense of an unfamiliar sound. The morning breeze had died completely, leaving an unnatural stillness that made even the normal forest sounds seem muted and distant. Silas found himself thinking of the old Arapaho stories Pete Mackenzie had shared during their visits. The indigenous peoples of this region had spoken of places where the spirit world touched the physical one, thin spots in reality where impossible things could slip through. Most whites dismissed such tales as superstition, but the mountain had taught Silas to respect the wisdom of those who'd lived here long before. His own people arrived. He carefully returned the egg to its nest and covered the clutch with his jacket to protect it from the cooling air. Standing, he walked slowly around the area, looking for clues about how these things had come to be buried near his woodpile. The ground showed no signs of digging other than Boone's fresh excavation. There were no tracks, no disturbed vegetation, nothing to suggest that any animal, mundane or otherwise, had been responsible for placing them there. The woodpile itself had been undisturbed when he'd added logs to it just 3 days ago. He was certain of that. Silas was a man who noticed details, a habit developed during his military service and refined by years of living where inattention could prove fatal. If these eggs had been here then, he would have seen some sign. That meant they'd appeared sometime in the last 72 hours, buried precisely in a spot where Boone would inevitably discover them during his morning patrol. The thought sent a chill down Silas's spine that had nothing to do with the mountain air. He spent the next hour examining the area more thoroughly, expanding his search in ever-widening circles around the nest. He found nothing. No tracks, no disturbances, no evidence of any visitation by man or beast. It was as if the eggs had simply materialized in place, complete with their impossible nest of familiar and alien materials. By noon, the sun had climbed high enough to warm the air considerably, but the eggs continued to radiate their steady heat. If anything, they seemed to be growing warmer. Silas had checked on them several times, each visit confirming that the strange, pulsing sensation was becoming more pronounced. Boone had settled into a watchful position about 10 feet from the nest, neither approaching nor retreating. The dog's behavior troubled Silas almost as much as the eggs themselves. In 8 years together, he'd never seen his companion so conflicted, torn between curiosity and what appeared to be instinctive wariness. As evening approached, Silas made a decision that went against every practical instinct he possessed. Rather than destroying the eggs or burying them deeper, he carefully moved them into his cabin. Something about leaving them outside felt wrong, though he couldn't articulate why. Perhaps it was the thought of other creatures discovering them, or maybe just the sense that whatever was happening here was his responsibility now. He placed the nest on his kitchen table, positioning it where he could keep watch while going about his evening routine. The eggs looked even stranger in the lamplight, their amber surfaces seeming to glow with an inner luminescence that made his vision blur if he stared too long. That night, sleep came in fragments. Every few hours, Silas would wake to check on the eggs, finding them unchanged, except for a gradual increase in the warmth they radiated. By morning, the air around the table felt noticeably warmer than the rest of the cabin. Despite the fire having burned down to coals, Boone had refused to come inside at all, choosing instead to spend the night on the porch, where he could maintain his vigil through the windows. The dog's behavior was perhaps the most unsettling aspect of the entire situation. In all their years together, Boone had never shown fear of anything Silas brought into their home. On the second morning, the first cracks appeared. Silas was drinking his coffee and watching the sunrise when he heard it, a sound like breaking glass, but softer, more musical. One of the eggs had developed a hairline fracture that ran from top to bottom, and as he watched, the crack widened slightly. The sense of anticipation that filled the cabin was almost tangible. Whatever was inside these shells was ready to emerge, and despite every rational thought telling him to stop what was happening, Silas found himself unable to look away. The moment of truth was approaching, and with it, the end of everything he thought he knew about the world. The cracking sound came again, more pronounced this time, followed by a soft rustling that made Silas's skin crawl. He set down his coffee with trembling hands and approached the table slowly. As if sudden movement might trigger something he wasn't prepared to face, the first egg had split completely in half, its amber shell falling away like broken pottery. What emerged defied every natural law Silas understood. The creature was no larger than his thumb, but it moved with a fluid grace that seemed almost serpentine. Its skin was translucent, revealing internal structures that pulsed with bioluminescent patterns. And it possessed too many limbs, or perhaps what he was seeing weren't limbs at all, but some other appendages for which he had no name. Most disturbing were its eyes, if they could be called eyes. Dark, multifaceted orbs that seemed to hold an intelligence far too advanced for something so small and newly hatched. When the creature turned toward him, Silas felt the unmistakable sensation of being studied, evaluated, perhaps even judged. A second egg cracked, then a third. Within minutes, all 6 had hatched, releasing their impossible occupants onto his kitchen table. The creatures moved in perfect coordination, as if guided by a shared consciousness. They explored their new environment with what appeared to be methodical curiosity, their strange appendages testing surfaces, textures, and even the air itself. Silas backed away slowly, his mind struggling to process what he was witnessing. These things violated everything he thought he knew about biology, about the natural order. They moved too fluidly, responded too intelligently, and seemed to communicate through subtle changes in their bioluminescent patterns. Outside, Boone began barking frantically. The sound was different from his earlier alert barks. This was pure alarm, the kind of sound a dog made when confronted with something that triggered every survival instinct. Silas glanced toward the window and felt his blood turn cold. The creatures on the table had gone completely still, their attention focused on something beyond the cabin walls. Their luminescent patterns had shifted to a deep red that pulsed in unison, like a synchronized heartbeat. Then as one, they turned toward the door. Silas grabbed his rifle from where it hung above the fireplace, though he had no idea what good it would do against creatures that seemed to exist outside normal reality. His hands shook as he checked the load, muscle memory from his military days taking over despite his fear. The scratching started at the door, not the familiar sound of Boone's claws, but something else, something that made long, deliberate grooves in the heavy wood. Through the window, Silas could see shapes moving in the tree line, dark forms that seemed to shift and flow rather than walk. One of the newly hatched creatures made a sound, a high-pitched trill that seemed to carry far beyond what its size should allow. The scratching at the door stopped immediately, replaced by a silence so complete that Silas could hear his own heartbeat. He realized with growing horror that the things outside weren't random predators drawn by coincidence. They were responding to the creatures in his cabin, called by some signal he couldn't perceive. The eggs hadn't been abandoned or lost. They were bait or perhaps beacons, drawing something from the deep wilderness to this exact spot. Boone's barking had changed again, becoming a series of sharp, panicked yelps. Silas peered through the window and saw his faithful companion backing toward the cabin, his hackles raised and his body trembling. Whatever was out there had the dog terrified in a way Silas had never seen. The creatures on his table began moving again, but their behavior had changed. Where before they had seemed curious and exploratory, now they moved with obvious purpose. They flowed across the table surface like living mercury, heading directly for the edge nearest the door. Silas watched in fascination and revulsion as they seemed to test the air, their appendages waving in patterns that suggested complex communication. A heavy thud against the cabin wall made him jump. Then another, from a different direction. Whatever was outside was circling the building, testing its defenses. Silas had built well. The logs were thick and the chinking tight, but he'd never imagined defending against anything like this. The trill sound came again, this time from all 6 creatures in unison. The harmony they created was both beautiful and terrifying, a sound that seemed to resonate in his bones. It was answered immediately by similar sounds from outside, a chorus that surrounded the cabin completely. Silas found himself thinking of his grandfather's old stories about the Civil War, tales of being surrounded by Confederate forces in the deep woods. "The waiting's always the worst part," the old man had said. "Once the shooting starts, training takes over. But the waiting, that's when your mind plays tricks on you." But this wasn't war as any human understood it. This was something older, more primal, a conflict between the natural world and forces that had no business existing within it. The creatures in his cabin weren't enemies exactly, but they weren't allies either. They were harbingers, advanced scouts for something larger and more dangerous. A new sound reached his ears, a rhythmic tapping against the window glass. Silas turned to see one of the dark shapes outside, pressing against the pane with appendages that left wet, viscous marks. The thing was larger than the creatures on his table, roughly the size of a house cat, but its form was similarly fluid and indefinable. Through the distorted glass, he could make out features that hurt to look at directly. The creature seemed to exist in a constant state of transformation, its outline shifting and flowing as if it couldn't quite decide what shape to hold. Only its eyes remained constant, the same multifaceted orbs he'd seen on the newly hatched specimens, but larger and somehow more aware. The creature in his cabin nearest the window responded to its larger cousin outside, their bioluminescent patterns synchronizing in a display that was both beautiful and ominous. Silas realized he was witnessing some form of communication that transcended normal senses, a conversation conducted in light and sound, and perhaps other frequencies he couldn't perceive. His military training told him to barricade the door and windows, to create defensive positions and wait for dawn. But something deeper, some instinct that predated civilization, whispered that traditional tactics would be useless here. These creatures operated by rules he didn't understand, with motivations that might be completely alien to human thinking. The lamp on his table flickered, casting shifting shadows that made the creatures seem even more otherworldly. Their movements had become more agitated, more purposeful. Whatever communication was taking place between those inside and those outside, it was reaching some kind of conclusion. Silas gripped his rifle tighter and tried to think like the soldier he'd once been. Every enemy had weaknesses, every situation had options. The problem was identifying what those might be when dealing with creatures that shouldn't exist in the first place. The attack came without warning, swift and coordinated in a way that spoke of intelligence far beyond what Silas had imagined possible. The creatures outside struck simultaneously at 3 different points: the door, the main window, and the small ventilation gap near the roof. The sound was like a thunderclap of breaking glass and splintering wood. Silas fired instinctively at the shadow flowing through his shattered window, the rifle's report deafening in the confined space. The bullet seemed to pass through the creature without effect, striking the far wall with a spray of wood chips. The thing barely paused, continuing its fluid advance across his floor. On the table, the 6 newly hatched creatures had gone completely still, their bioluminescent patterns now a steady, pulsing crimson. They watched the chaos with what appeared to be calm assessment, as if this violent intrusion was exactly what they'd been expecting. Boone burst through the damaged door, his fur standing on end and his eyes wild with terror. The dog immediately positioned himself between Silas and the advancing creatures, growling with a ferocity that seemed to give even these otherworldly beings pause. "Good boy," Silas whispered, working the rifle's bolt to chamber another round. "We stand together." The larger creature that had entered through the window began to change shape, its fluid form expanding and contracting as if testing different configurations. Silas caught glimpses of features that made no biological sense, appendages that appeared and disappeared, surfaces that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, and always those terrible, intelligent eyes. A second creature flowed through the door, moving with the same liquid grace. This one was smaller, but seemed more aggressive, advancing directly toward the table where the hatchlings waited. Silas realized with growing horror that these weren't random predators. They were coming specifically for the creatures he'd inadvertently harbored. He fired again, this time at the creature near the table. The bullet had no more effect than before, passing through the thing's shifting form without causing visible damage. But the sound and muzzle flash seemed to disrupt its movement momentarily, giving him a crucial insight into their nature. "They don't like loud sounds," he muttered, ejecting the spent cartridge and loading another. The military training he'd thought rusty came flooding back. Assess, adapt, survive. If bullets wouldn't work, he needed to find what would. The creatures on his table began moving again, flowing down the table legs with surprising speed. But instead of joining their larger cousins, they scattered in different directions, as if seeking hiding places. Their behavior suggested they weren't allies of the intruders. They were prey. This realization changed everything. Whatever these things were, they weren't a unified species. The hatchlings were running from the larger ones, which meant there were at least two factions at work here. The question was whether either side could be considered friendly to human interests. A third creature squeezed through the ventilation gap, dropping to the floor with a wet sound that made Silas's stomach turn. This one was different from the others, more solid-looking, with what appeared to be actual limbs rather than the flowing appendages of its companions. Its eyes, however, were the same multifaceted orbs that marked all of these beings. Boone lunged at the newcomer, his teeth bared in a snarl that came from somewhere deep in his canine ancestry. To Silas's amazement, the dog's attack seemed to have an effect. The creature recoiled, its form becoming less stable, as if Boone's presence somehow interfered with its coherence. "That's it, boy. Keep after them!" Silas grabbed a lantern from his shelf and hurled it at the creature near the window. The glass shattered against its form, and the kerosene ignited in a brilliant flash. The thing recoiled with what sounded like a scream, its bioluminescent patterns shifting to chaotic, panicked flashing. Fire. They didn't like fire any more than they liked loud sounds. Silas filed this information away as he grabbed a burning stick from his fireplace, wielding it like a torch. The creatures immediately backed away, their fluid forms seeming to contract and solidify in the presence of the flames. One of the hatchlings had taken refuge behind the water barrel in the corner. As Silas watched, it began to pulse with a different pattern. Not the aggressive red of before, but a soft blue-green that seemed almost grateful. The idea that these things could feel gratitude was disturbing in ways he couldn't articulate. The larger creatures were regrouping near the door, their forms flowing together in a way that suggested they were communicating. Their bioluminescent displays had become more complex, creating patterns that hurt to look at directly. Silas found himself growing dizzy, as if the lights were affecting his brain in ways evolution had never prepared him for. "Whatever you are," he said, raising his makeshift torch higher, "you're not welcome here." The response was immediate and terrifying. All three creatures began to pulse in unison, their combined light filling the cabin with an otherworldly glow. The effect was hypnotic, and Silas felt his grip on the torch beginning to weaken as his consciousness threatened to slip. "Away!" Boone's sharp bark snapped, him back to awareness just in time to see one of the creatures flowing toward him with obvious hostile intent. He swung the torch in a wide arc, scattering burning debris across the floor. The creatures retreated again, but he could see they were learning, adapting their tactics to account for his defenses. A new sound reached his ears, more scratching, but from outside. The noise was coming from all directions now, as if the cabin was surrounded by dozens of these things. The three inside had been just the advance guard. The hatchling behind the water barrel made a soft trilling sound, different from the aggressive calls he'd heard before. This one sounded almost like a warning, and as if in response, the larger creatures suddenly stopped their advance and began flowing back toward the broken window and door. They were retreating, but Silas knew it wasn't because of his torch or Boone's courage. Something else was coming, something that even these nightmare creatures feared. In the sudden silence that followed their departure, he could hear it, a deep, rhythmic sound that seemed to come from the earth itself, like the heartbeat of something unimaginably large, stirring to life beneath the mountain. The rhythmic pounding grew stronger, shaking dust from the cabin's rafters and causing the remaining glass in the windows to vibrate in their frames. Silas pressed his ear to the floor and felt the vibrations through the thick wooden planks, whatever was making. That sound was massive and getting closer. The hatchling behind the water barrel had emerged from its hiding place and was moving toward him with obvious purpose. Its bioluminescent patterns had shifted to a complex sequence of blues and greens that seemed almost like language. As it approached, Silas felt a strange sensation in his mind, like whispered words just below the threshold of hearing. Danger. Ancient. Must flee. The thoughts weren't his own. Somehow, the creature was communicating directly with his consciousness, bypassing his ears entirely. The realization should have terrified him, but instead he felt an odd sense of relief. For the first time since this nightmare began, something was trying to help him understand what's coming. He whispered to the creature, feeling foolish for talking to something the size of his thumb. The response came as a flood of images and sensations that made his head spin. He saw vast caverns deep beneath the mountain, filled with creatures that dwarfed the ones he'd encountered. Ancient things that had slumbered for centuries, awakened now by the presence of the hatchlings on the surface. The eggs hadn't been randomly placed. They were triggers, designed to rouse something that should have remained asleep. We are bait. You are bait. All living things become food. Boone whined softly and pressed against Silas's leg. The dog's fur was standing on end, and his ears swiveled constantly as he tried to track sounds that seemed to come from everywhere at once. Through their years together, Silas had learned to trust his companion's instincts, and right now, every line of the dog's body spoke of mortal danger. Another hatchling emerged from beneath his bed, its patterns matching those of the first. Then a third appeared from behind the stove. All six had survived the attack and were now converging on him, their collective communication growing stronger and more urgent. The sleeper wakes. The mountain breaks. Fire and high ground, only hope. The images that accompanied these thoughts were horrifying. Silas saw the mountain splitting open like a cracked egg, releasing creatures that moved like living shadows across the landscape. He saw forests burning, not from normal fire, but from some kind of energy that consumed everything in its path. Most disturbing of all, he saw humans fleeing in terror, their minds shattered by contact with intelligences too alien to comprehend. "How long do we have?" he asked aloud. "Hours, maybe less." "It feeds on fear first, flesh second." Silas looked around his cabin, his home for 20 years, and felt a profound sense of loss. Everything he'd built here, everything he'd worked for, was about to be destroyed by forces beyond his comprehension. But Martha's voice seemed to echo in his memory, something she'd said during her final days. "Sometimes the only victory is choosing how you face the end." He began moving with grim purpose, gathering supplies he would need for whatever came next. His military pack went on first, followed by ammunition, medical supplies, and what food would travel well. The hatchlings watched his preparations with what appeared to be approval, their patterns shifting to encourage him when he made good choices and warning him away from items that would be useless in what lay ahead. Boone had positioned himself by the door, his body tense and ready to move. The dog understood that they were leaving, and his earlier terror had transformed into the kind of focused alertness that had served them well during dangerous situations in the past. The pounding from below had developed a rhythm now, like some massive heart beating in the depths of the earth. With each pulse, small objects in the cabin rattled and shifted. Silas's coffee mug fell from the table and shattered on the floor, the sharp sound making all 6 hatchlings freeze momentarily. Soon, very soon, one of the creatures flowed up onto his shoulder, its tiny form weighing almost nothing but radiating warmth like a living coal. When it touched his skin, the mental connection became stronger and clearer. He could sense its alien perspective on the world. its understanding of energies and forces that had no names in human language. Through its senses, he perceived the mountain as a living entity, riddled with passages and chambers that formed a vast network of arteries and organs. Something ancient and vast lay at its heart, something that had been sleeping since before his species existed. The hatchlings weren't native to this world. They were refugees from somewhere else, fleeing a catastrophe that had consumed their own realm. Your kind calls it many names: demon, devil, old god. We know it as hunger that walks. The creature shared more images, showing him glimpses of worlds where this entity had fed before. Planets stripped bare of life, their surfaces cracked and lifeless. Civilizations that had tried to fight and been consumed, not just physically but spiritually, their very essence absorbed to fuel the creature's endless appetite. Why here? Why now? The barriers grow thin. Your people's pain calls to it. Wars and suffering create weakness in the walls between worlds. Silas thought about the news reports Pete Mackenzie had shared during his last visit. Conflict spreading across the globe. Natural disasters increasing in frequency and intensity. The general sense that the world was spiraling toward some kind of crisis. If the creature was drawn to suffering, then humanity had certainly provided plenty of invitation. The rhythmic pounding suddenly stopped, leaving a silence so complete that Silas could hear his own heartbeat. The hatchlings on his body went completely still, their bioluminescent patterns dimming to almost nothing. It wakes. It rises. Time to choose. Through the cabin's damaged windows, Silas could see the forest beginning to change. Trees that had stood for decades were leaning away from the mountain as if blown by invisible wind. Birds that should have been roosting for the night were fleeing in massive flocks, their cries creating a cacophony of terror that echoed across the valley. Most disturbing of all, the very air seemed to be thickening, taking on a quality that made it hard to breathe. Each inhalation felt heavy and wrong, as if the atmosphere itself was being transformed by the presence of something that had no business existing in this reality. The ground beneath the cabin groaned and shifted, and Silas realized with crystalline clarity that his time for preparation was over. Whatever was coming would arrive within minutes, and his choices now would determine not just his own survival, but possibly the fate of everyone who lived in the valley below. The first crack appeared in the cabin floor directly beneath the kitchen table, a hairline fracture that widened as Silas watched. Steam hissed up through the gap, carrying with it a smell that was both metallic and organic, like blood mixed with copper pennies. The hatchlings on his shoulders began to pulse urgently, their mental voices joining in a chorus of warning. Move now. High ground. The firestones, Silas asked, but the creatures were already flowing down from his shoulders, heading toward the door with obvious purpose. Their meaning became clear as one of them paused by his fireplace, its patterns shifting to indicate the collection of smooth river rocks he'd used to line the hearth. Understanding flooded through him. These weren't ordinary stones. They were something else, something the hatchlings recognized as important. He'd found them years ago while exploring a cave system higher up the mountain, drawn to them by their unusual weight and the way they seemed to hold heat longer than normal rock. He'd thought them merely curious geological specimens. Working quickly, Silas gathered the stones into a canvas bag, their warmth evident even through the thick fabric. The largest was about the size of his fist, while the smallest were no bigger than marbles. He'd collected dozens over the years, never understanding their significance until now. Ancient weapons, made by the first ones to hold back the hunger. The crack in his floor widened with a sound like breaking bones. Through the gap, he could see a faint reddish glow that pulsed in rhythm with the distant pounding. Whatever lay beneath was using the mountain's geological structure as a conduit, following the natural fissures and fault lines to reach the surface. Boone was already at the door, whining and pawing at the frame. The dog's instincts were screaming at him to flee, and Silas knew they were right. But as he looked around the cabin one last time, he felt the weight of everything he was abandoning. 20 years of memories, the carefully constructed life he'd built to honor Martha's memory. The photograph of their wedding day caught his eye, and without thinking he grabbed it from the shelf. The frame was cracked from the vibrations, but the image remained intact. Martha's smile radiant in her white dress, his own younger face filled with hope and love. Some things were worth carrying, even into hell itself. Sentiment will not save you. Speed will, I know, he muttered, tucking the photograph inside his jacket. A man's got to carry something of who he was, or he becomes just another animal running in the dark. The hatchlings seemed to understand this reasoning, their mental touch softening with what felt like sympathy. These creatures had lost their own world, their own memories and connections. They knew the pain of leaving everything behind. He shouldered his pack and grabbed his rifle, though the hatchling's mental communication suggested conventional weapons would be useless against what was coming. Still, the familiar weight of the gun brought comfort, a reminder of his military training and the battles he'd survived before. The cabin's main beam groaned overhead, and dust showered down from the rafters. Through the damaged windows, Silas could see that the entire mountainside was beginning to shift. Trees that had stood for centuries were toppling as the ground beneath them buckled and heaved. In the distance he could hear the sound of rock slides and the crash of falling timber, the trail to Eagle's Rest, high stone safe from the hungers. Reached at Eagle's Rest was a granite outcropping about 3 miles up the mountain, accessible only by a narrow trail that wound through some of the most treacherous terrain in the region. Silas had climbed it once, years ago, and remembered it as a place where the rocks seemed different somehow, older and more solid than the surrounding stone. If the hatchlings were right about high ground providing safety, it was their best option. The floor beneath his feet lurched suddenly, and a section near the stove collapsed entirely, revealing a shaft that dropped into red-lit darkness. The smell that emerged was overwhelming, not just the metallic scent he'd noticed before, but something that made his primitive brain scream warnings about predators and death. Go, now, before it sees. Silas burst through the damaged door with Boone at his side, the hatchlings clinging to his clothes like tiny guides. The night air was thick and wrong, filled with static electricity that made his hair stand on end. Above them, the stars were flickering, as if the very fabric of space was being distorted by the presence of something that didn't belong in this reality. The trail to Eagle's Rest began behind his woodshed, marked by blazes he'd carved years ago during his exploration of the upper mountain. In daylight it was challenging but manageable. At night, with the ground shifting beneath his feet and an ancient horror awakening below, it would be a nightmare. But as they started up the slope, Silas felt something he hadn't experienced since Martha's death, a sense of purpose beyond mere survival. The hatchlings weren't just refugees seeking safety. They were warriors in their own way, carriers of knowledge and weapons that could make a difference in the battle to come. The Firestones must reach the high place. The old protections must be renewed. What happens if we don't make it? He asked as they climbed. The answer came not in words, but in images, the mountains splitting open like rotten fruit, releasing a tide of darkness that would spread across the continent. Cities consumed in hours, millions of people reduced to mindless thralls, serving an appetite that could never be satisfied. The end of everything recognizable as human civilization. Behind them, his cabin exploded into flames as something massive emerged from the crack in his floor. The fire wasn't natural. It burned too bright, too hot, casting shadows that moved independently of the flames. Through the mental link with the hatchlings, Silas felt an alien satisfaction, as if the entity below was pleased with the destruction. It feeds on loss. Your pain makes it stronger, then I won't give it the satisfaction, Silas growled, forcing himself not to look back at the burning remains of his home. Instead, he focused on the trail ahead, on the treacherous climb that might be their only hope of survival. Boone bounded ahead, his natural agility allowing him to navigate the rocky path with ease. The dog paused occasionally to look back, making sure his human companion was keeping up. In the flickering light of the unnatural fire below, Silas could see that his faithful friends, Eyes held the same grim determination that had carried them through every hardship of their shared life. They were no longer running from the danger. They were racing toward whatever hope remained. Halfway up the treacherous trail to Eagle's Rest, Silas paused to catch his breath and check on their pursuit. The fire below had spread beyond his cabin, consuming everything in a widening circle that defied natural laws. Trees burst into flame without the fire even touching them, as if the very presence of the entity was enough to ignite the world around it. But it was what he saw in the flames that made his blood run cold. Figures moved within the inferno, human shapes that walked unharmed through the supernatural fire. At first, Silas thought his eyes were playing tricks on him, that the stress and exhaustion were causing hallucinations. But as he watched, one of the figures turned toward the mountain slope, and even at this distance, he recognized the face. Pete Mackenzie, the man who'd been bringing supplies up the mountain for 15 years, who'd shared countless meals and conversations in that cabin, now consumed by otherworldly flames. Pete stood in the fire as if it were merely warm sunlight, his familiar features unchanged except for his eyes, which now held the same multifaceted quality as the creatures. They have been among you for years, preparing, watching, waiting. The hatchling's mental voice carried a tone of grim revelation, and suddenly pieces began falling into place with horrible clarity. Pete's uncanny ability to navigate the mountain trails in any weather, his knowledge of paths that weren't on any map, the way he always seemed to know exactly when to arrive, as if he possessed some supernatural awareness of Silas's needs. "How long?" Silas whispered, his throat tight with betrayal and fear. "Since the first eggs were placed. He has been the shepherd, guiding the flock towards slaughter." More figures emerged from the flames, men and women Silas recognized from Millerville, people he'd known for decades. Sarah Chen from the general store, who'd always had an uncanny knowledge of what supplies he'd need before he asked. Tom Rodriguez, the postmaster, who'd delivered letters from Martha's relatives with an efficiency that now seemed suspicious. Dr. Elizabeth Harper, who tended to his occasional injuries with a skill that went beyond normal medical training. All of them walked unharmed through the supernatural fire, their faces serene and their movements unnaturally coordinated. They weren't victims of the entity. They were its servants, possibly its offspring, planted in human society to prepare for this moment. Your species calls them changelings, body snatchers, doppelgangers. The truth is simpler and worse. They are grown, not stolen. Bred in the deep places to replace key individuals. How many? Silas asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted to know the answer. In your valley? Perhaps a dozen. Across your world? Thousands. They have been preparing for the hunger's awakening for decades. The implications staggered him. If creatures had been replacing humans for that long, how many government officials, military leaders, and scientists were actually alien infiltrators? How many crucial decisions had been influenced by inhuman intelligence, working toward this moment of catastrophe? Boone whined softly and pressed against his leg. The dog had always been wary of Pete, Silas realized now. Animals possessed instincts that evolution had honed to detect predators and threats. Boone had been trying to warn him for years, but human arrogance had dismissed the dog's unease as mere antisocial behavior. Below them, the figures in the flames had begun moving up the mountain with purpose. Their movements were too fluid, too coordinated, like dancers following choreography rehearsed countless times. They weren't climbing the trail. They were flowing up the slope directly, their forms adapting to the terrain in ways that defied human limitations. They come for the firestones. They know what you carry. Then we'd better not let them have it, Silas said grimly, shouldering his pack and resuming the climb. But his mind was reeling with the scope of the deception. How long had he been living in an illusion? How many of his interactions over the past 20 years had been with creatures wearing human faces? The trail grew steeper, forcing him to use his hands to scramble over rocky outcroppings. Behind them, the pursuing figures had spread out in a net formation, closing off escape routes with military precision. These weren't mindless monsters. They were intelligent, organized, and utterly ruthless in their efficiency. There is more you must know. About the stones. About your role in what comes next. What role? I'm just a man trying to survive. The response came as a flood of images that made his head spin. He saw himself not as he was now, but as others saw him, a guardian placed in this specific location for this specific purpose. The random events that had led him to this mountain weren't random at all. Martha's death, his grief-driven exile, even his discovery of the Firestones, all of it had been orchestrated by forces that played games across centuries. The first ones knew this day would come. They prepared guardians, scattered them across your world like seeds. Most never awakened to their purpose. You are among the few who remain. Guardians of what? The barriers, the seals, the locks that keep the hunger contained between feedings. More images flooded his consciousness. Ancient sites around the world where similar stones waited, where other guardians had lived and died without knowing their true purpose. Stone circles in Ireland, temple ruins in Cambodia, cave paintings in Australia, all of them connected by an invisible network of power that had held back cosmic horrors for millennia. The stones must reach the high place. The ritual must be completed. If not here, then nowhere. The weight of responsibility settled on his shoulders like a physical burden. He wasn't just fleeing for his own survival. He was carrying the last hope of preventing a catastrophe that would consume everything he'd ever cared about. The knowledge was almost too much to bear, but Martha's voice echoed in his memory again. When the world asks everything of you, you give what you can and trust God for the rest. A new sound reached his ears, helicopters approaching from the south. For a moment, hope fled in his chest. Perhaps the military had detected the disturbance and was responding. But as the aircraft came into view, that hope died. The helicopters were flying in perfect formation despite the supernatural atmospheric disturbances that should have made flight impossible. Their movements were too precise, too coordinated, suggesting that their pilots were either superhuman or not human at all. They have had decades to prepare. Your military, your government, how many crucial positions do you think they have filled? The scope of the infiltration was breathtaking in its audacity. If key positions in the military and government were compromised, then conventional resistance would be impossible. Humanity's own weapons and institutions would be turned against them, used to facilitate their own destruction. Eagle's Rest loomed ahead, its granite bulk offering the promise of safety. But Silas now understood that even if they reached it, their real work would just be beginning. The Firestones weren't just weapons. They were components in some ancient system designed to reinforce the barriers between worlds. You begin to understand. The climb is not escape, it is pilgrimage. The stones are not tools, they are keys. And you are not victim, you are chosen. Chosen for what? To decide whether your species deserves to survive its first contact with the infinite. The answer chilled him more than the mountain air. This wasn't just about defeating a monster or saving lives. It was a test, a cosmic examination of humanity's worthiness to continue existing in a universe far stranger and more dangerous than anyone had imagined. Behind them, the pursuing figures had gained ground, their inhuman abilities allowing them to climb with supernatural speed. The helicopters circled overhead like mechanical vultures, their searchlights cutting through the darkness with surgical precision. But ahead, the granite walls of Eagle's Rest caught the moonlight like a beacon, promising answers and perhaps salvation if they could reach it in time. Silas pushed himself harder, driven now not just by survival instinct, but by the terrible knowledge that failure here would doom every human being on Earth. The final 100 yards to Eagle's Rest were the longest of Silas's life. The granite outcropping rose before them like an ancient fortress, its weathered walls catching starlight and holding it like trapped moonbeams. But the approach was treacherous, a narrow ledge barely wide enough for one person, with a sheer drop on one side and vertical rock on the other. Below them, the pursuing figures had reached the base of the final ascent. In the supernatural light that emanated from the burning forest, Silas could see them clearly now. The beings that wore familiar faces were changing, their human disguises beginning to slip as they prepared for the final assault. Pete Mackenzie's features flowed like melting wax, revealing the multifaceted eyes and translucent skin beneath. The others were similarly transforming, becoming something that belonged in nightmare rather than reality. They drop their masks because they no longer need deception. The awakening is so close that secrecy serves no purpose. The hatchlings clinging to his jacket had grown silent, their bioluminescent patterns dimmed to almost nothing. Through their mental connection, Silas could sense their exhaustion and fear. These tiny beings had fled across impossible distances to bring their warning, and now they were as close to their breaking point as he was. Boone reached the ledge first, his natural agility serving him well on the narrow path. The dog turned back to watch Silas's progress, his eyes reflecting an intelligence that seemed almost human in its concern. In 8 years together they had faced many dangers, but nothing that compared to this cosmic horror threatening to devour everything they'd ever known. The helicopters had taken position around the outcropping, their searchlights creating a web of brilliant illumination that made stealth impossible. But something was wrong with the aircraft. Their rotors made no sound, and they hovered with instability that defied aerodynamics. Silas realized these weren't human vehicles at all, but some kind of alien technology designed to mimic familiar forms. Your military thinks they are conducting a rescue operation. The creatures have convinced them that you are a terrorist threatening national security. The bitter irony wasn't lost on him. In trying to save humanity, he'd been painted as its enemy. But that was how these beings operated, using humanity's own institutions and reflexes against them, turning their strengths into weaknesses. As he edged along the ledge, Silas's hand brushed against the bag of firestones. Even through the thick canvas, he could feel their warmth increasing. The ancient artifacts were responding to their proximity to whatever lay hidden within Eagle's Rest, resonating with energies that predated human civilization, almost there. The chamber lies beneath the granite, hidden from sight but not from those who know how to look. How do I access it? The stones will show you. They remember their purpose even when their guardians have forgotten. The ledge ended at a flat platform, perhaps 20 feet square, surrounded on 3 sides by towering granite walls. This was Eagle's Rest proper, the place where he'd once come to think and remember Martha. Now it would serve as the battleground for humanity's survival. But as Silas stepped onto the platform, he saw something that made his blood freeze. He wasn't the first guardian to reach this place. Scattered across the granite were the remains of others who had made this desperate journey, skeletons still clutching bags of similar stones. Their bones bleached white by decades of mountain weather. Many have tried. All have failed. The ritual requires more than stones and determination. What else does it require? The answer came not from the hatchlings, but from the granite itself. As his feet touched the center of the platform, symbols began to glow beneath the weathered surface, ancient writing that hurt to look at directly. The message was clear even without translation. A guardian's life was the key that activated the stones, the final component in a ritual designed to reinforce the barriers between worlds. Martha's photograph crinkled against his chest as he knelt beside one of the skeletons. The bones belonged to a woman, her clothing suggesting she died sometime in the 1940s. Beside her lay a leather journal, its pages remarkably preserved by the dry mountain air. With trembling hands, Silas opened the journal and read the final entry. Written in a woman's careful script, "The stones grow warm as the darkness rises. I understand now what my grandmother meant when she spoke of the family's burden. We are not guardians of treasure, but guardians of humanity itself. If anyone finds this record, know that the choice must be made freely. The barrier requires willing sacrifice, not merely death. Tell my children I loved them. Each guardian has chosen differently. Some died in battle, their sacrifice wasted because they did not understand the true nature of the ritual. Others completed the working but died bitter and resentful, their negative emotions weakening the barrier they died to create. Silas looked up at the fake helicopters circling overhead, then down at the inhuman figures beginning their ascent of the ledge. Time was running out, and he still didn't fully understand what was expected of him. The willing sacrifice. What exactly does that mean? The barrier feeds on life force freely given, not death taken by force, but life offered in love. The guardian must choose to give everything for those they protect, holding no resentment, no regret, no anger at the unfairness of it all. The weight of expectation settled on him like a mountain. How could anyone face death without resentment? How could he give his life willingly when he still had so much to live for? So many memories of Martha to cherish in the quiet years he'd hoped lay ahead. But even as these thoughts formed, he found himself thinking of the people in the valley below, families he'd never met, children who deserved to grow up in a world not dominated by cosmic horrors. Pete Mackenzie might have been an alien infiltrator, but the general store where he'd shopped was real. The postmaster might have been a creature in disguise, but the letters he'd delivered were genuine communications from Martha's family. Humanity, for all its flaws, was worth preserving. Understanding begins. But understanding alone is not enough. The ritual must be performed correctly, or the sacrifice achieves nothing. The first of the pursuing creatures reached the platform, flowing up over the edge with inhuman grace. It had abandoned all pretense of human form now, appearing as a writhing mass of translucent flesh and multifaceted eyes. When it spoke, the voice was Pete's, but the words came from multiple mouths arranged around its surface. You cannot complete the ritual, old man. Too many guardians have tried and failed. The stones require more power than any single human can provide. Silas stood slowly, his hand closing around the bag of firestones. Maybe that's because they were trying to do it alone. The creature that had been Pete laughed, a sound like breaking glass. Your dog cannot help you. The small ones clinging to your clothes are refugees, not allies. You have no army, no weapons, no hope. I've got something better than an army, Silas said, pulling Martha's photograph from his jacket. I've got love worth dying for. The words seemed to activate something in the stones. Their warmth increased dramatically, and the symbols carved into the granite began to pulse with increasing intensity. Around the platform, the air itself began to shimmer as if reality was becoming unstable. Now, the moment approaches. But beware, the enemy will try to corrupt your sacrifice, to turn love into hatred, peace into violence. You must hold to what is pure in your heart, even as everything else falls apart. More creatures flowed onto the platform, surrounding him in a circle of alien flesh and malevolent intelligence. The helicopters descended closer, their silent rotors creating a whirlwind that should have been deafening, but made no sound at all. In the center of it all, Silas knelt and began removing the firestones from their canvas bag. Each one pulsed with ancient power, warm and alive in his hands. As he arranged them in the pattern, the glowing symbols indicated. He thought not of death but of life. Martha's laughter on their wedding day. Boone's faithful companionship through 8 long winters. The simple pleasure of watching sunrise from his cabin porch. The ritual was beginning, and with it, the final test of everything he believed about love, sacrifice, and the value of human existence in an infinite and often hostile universe. The firestones arranged themselves into a perfect circle around Silas, each one pulsing with increasing intensity as the ancient pattern took shape. The moment the final stone touched the granite, the world exploded into chaos. The creatures surrounding the platform abandoned any remaining pretense of strategy or subtlety. They flowed forward as one, a tide of translucent flesh and alien intelligence intent on stopping the ritual before it could reach completion. But as they touched the perimeter marked by the stones, brilliant light erupted from the granite surface, forcing them back with sounds that might have been screams or might have been something beyond human comprehension. The barrier recognizes the pattern, but it needs more. It needs the Guardian's willing gift, Silas knelt in the center of the circle, Martha's photograph clutched in one hand, while the other rested on the largest firestone. The ancient artifact was now so hot it should have burned his flesh. But instead, it felt warm and comforting, like Martha's hand on a cold winter morning. Above them, the silent helicopters had begun to spark and malfunction as the energies being released interfered with their alien technology. One by one, they crashed into the mountainside, their facades of human engineering dissolving to reveal the twisted biomechanical horrors beneath. "You understand nothing of sacrifice," the creature that had been Pete snarled from the edge of the circle. Its form was constantly shifting now, unable to maintain even basic cohesion in the presence of the activated stones. "Your species thinks love conquers all, but love is just another form of selfishness. You die for those you care about while ignoring the suffering of strangers." Silas looked up from the photograph, meeting the creature's multifaceted gaze without fear. "Maybe you're right. Maybe human love is selfish. But I'd rather be selfish in defense of something beautiful than perfect, in service of nothing." The stones pulsed brighter, and the symbols carved into the granite began to rise from the surface, forming three-dimensional patterns that hurt to perceive directly. Through his connection with the hatchlings, Silas could sense the cosmic machinery beginning to activate, ancient mechanisms that had waited millennia for this moment. The hunger stirs below. It senses what you attempt and rises to stop it. The mountain will not contain it much longer. As if in response to the hatchling's warning, the entire platform shuddered. Cracks appeared in the granite, and through them seeped the same red light that had consumed his cabin. The entity awakening beneath the mountain was no longer content to send servants. It was coming itself. Boone had positioned himself just outside the stone circle, his hackles raised and his teeth bared at the surrounding creatures. The dog's loyalty was absolute, and even faced with horrors beyond natural comprehension, he refused to abandon his human companion. "Good boy," Silas whispered. "You've been the best friend a man could ask for." The dog's ears flickered at the words, and for a moment their eyes met across the barrier of light. In that gaze, Silas saw not just canine devotion, but something deeper, a recognition that this was goodbye, and an acceptance that some things were worth dying for. The platform lurched again, more violently this time. A section of granite near the edge crumbled away, revealing a shaft that dropped into red-lit infinity. From its depths came a sound that was part roar, part whisper, part song. The voice of something so vast and alien that human minds could only process fragments of its true nature. It comes. The hunger that walks rises to claim its prize. But the pattern is not yet complete. You must choose now, your life for the barrier, or watch your world burn. Silas closed his eyes and thought of Martha's final days, when the cancer had reduced her to little more than pain and determination. She had faced death with a grace that shamed his own fear, had spoken of love as something that transcended physical existence. "Death isn't the opposite of life," she'd whispered in the hospital. "It's just another way of loving." He opened his eyes and looked at her photograph one last time, her smile radiant with the joy of a woman who had found something worth living for. Then he placed the picture on the central stone and pressed both hands against the ancient artifact. "For Martha," he said quietly. "For Boone, for everyone who deserves a chance to find what we had." The moment his words ended, the firestones erupted with power that turned night into day. The circle of light expanded outward, washing over the platform and sending the alien creatures fleeing in terror. But this was only the beginning. Silas could feel the barrier forming around him, drawing on his life force to strengthen the cosmic walls that held back the infinite dark. Pain lanced through his body as the ritual began to consume him. But it was pain given willingly, transformed by love into something that felt almost like peace. Through the mental link with the hatchlings, he could sense the network of barriers around the world responding, other ancient sites awakening as his sacrifice provided the key that unlocked their dormant power. Hold fast. The worst is yet to come. The mountain split open like a cracked egg, and from its depths rose something that had no business existing in any sane universe. The hunger that walks was vast beyond comprehension, a writhing mass of shadow and appetite that seemed to exist in multiple dimensions simultaneously. Where it touched reality, the very fabric of space-time began to unravel, creating tiers through which glimpsed other worlds, dead worlds, consumed worlds, places where life had once flourished before being devoured by this cosmic cancer. But the barrier held. The network of firestones blazed with power drawn from Silas's willing sacrifice, creating a dome of protection that the entity could not breach. Each time it pressed against the barrier, the ancient defenses flared brighter, fed by the love and determination of a man who had chosen to give everything for strangers he would never meet. It cannot pass, but neither can it be destroyed. The barrier will hold only as long as the sacrifice remains pure. The creature that had been Pete Mackenzie circled the edge of the protected zone, its form now completely alien, but its voice still mockingly familiar. "You think love makes you strong," it taunted, "but love makes you vulnerable. We know what you treasured, old man. We know what will break your noble heart." The air within the barrier shimmered, and suddenly Martha stood before him, not as a memory or photograph, but as real and solid as the day he'd married her. She looked exactly as she had before the cancer, her hair rich and dark, her eyes bright with the intelligence and humor that had first captured his heart. "Silas," she said, her voice carrying all the warmth he remembered. "Why did you leave me? Why did you run away to this God-forsaken mountain when I needed you most?" The words hit him like physical blows. This was his deepest guilt, the shame he'd carried for 20 years. He had fled after her death, had abandoned their shared life and friends because he couldn't bear the weight of memories. In the depths of his grief, he'd convinced himself it was honoring her memory, but the truth was simpler and more painful. He had run because staying hurt too much. It is not her. It is the hunger wearing her face, speaking your fears to corrupt the sacrifice. But knowing the truth intellectually and feeling it emotionally were different things. The figure before him captured every detail of Martha's appearance, every mannerism and inflection. When she smiled, it was with the same slight asymmetry that had made her face so beautifully unique. When she reached toward him, it was with the same graceful gesture she'd used to comfort him through countless smaller griefs. "I waited for you," the false Martha continued. "I waited in that hospital bed, hoping you'd find the courage to stay and fight for us. But you were always a coward, weren't you? Always running when things got difficult." The firestones began to flicker, their light dimming as doubt crept into Silas's heart. The barrier wavered, and through the cracks he could see the hunger pressing closer, sensing weakness in the Guardian's resolve. Remember the truth. Remember why she loved you. Remember what she said about love transcending death. Silas closed his eyes and thought back to Martha's actual final words, not the cruel fabrication before him now. She had been weak, barely able to speak, but her message had been clear. Love doesn't end with death, Silas. It just changes form. "Carry me with you wherever you go." He opened his eyes and looked at the false Martha with newfound clarity. "You're right about one thing," he said quietly. "I was a coward. I ran because I was afraid of living without her. But I learned something on this mountain that you'll never understand." The false Martha's expression shifted, becoming less certain. "What's that?" "Love isn't about holding on. It's about letting go when the time comes, and trusting that what you built together is strong enough to survive the separation." He picked up Martha's photograph from the central stone, holding it up so the false image could see. "This is Martha. Not perfect, not without flaws, but real in ways you'll never comprehend. She wouldn't want me to die bitter and guilty. She'd want me to die knowing that our love was worth celebrating, even if it had to end." The firestones blazed with renewed power, their light becoming so intense that the false Martha began to dissolve, her features melting away to reveal the writhing alien flesh beneath. The barrier expanded, pushing back against the hunger with force that made the entity recoil. Now, while the sacrifice burns pure. Complete the pattern. Silas pressed his hands to the largest stone and felt his life force flowing into the ancient network. But instead of pain, he felt Martha's presence, not the false version conjured by the enemy, but the real woman he'd loved, somehow present in this moment of ultimate need. "I'm here," her voice whispered in his mind. "I've been here all along, waiting for you to understand that love doesn't require your physical presence. It just requires you to keep choosing it, even when everything else is taken away." The mountain shook as the hunger made one final assault on the barrier. But it was too late. The sacrifice was complete, the pattern fulfilled, and the barriers around the world blazed to life with power that would hold back the darkness for another age. The first thing Silas noticed was the silence. Not the oppressive quiet that had preceded the entity's awakening, but a peaceful stillness that spoke of balance restored and ancient hungers satisfied. The red light that had seeped from the mountain's depths was gone, replaced by ordinary starlight that painted the granite platform in silver and shadow. He was still alive, though he wasn't entirely sure how. The firestones lay cold and dark around him, their ancient purpose fulfilled. The barrier they had created was invisible now, but he could sense its presence like a warm current in the air, a protective field that stretched far beyond this mountain to encompass the entire world. You live because the sacrifice was pure. Love freely given returns threefold. The hatchlings still clung to his jacket, their bioluminescent patterns now a gentle blue-green that spoke of peace rather than alarm. Through their mental connection, he could sense their gratitude and relief. They had found what they came seeking, a guardian willing to pay the price for humanity's protection. Boone approached cautiously, sniffing the air with the careful attention of a dog who had learned to trust his instincts above all else. The creatures that had pursued them were gone, dissolved back into whatever dimension had spawned them when the barrier sealed the breach between worlds. The false helicopters lay scattered around the mountainside as twisted wreckage, their alien technology no longer able to maintain its human facade. "We did it." "Oi," Silas whispered, reaching out to stroke his companion's fur. "We actually did it." The dog pressed against his leg with a contentment that suggested he understood, at least in part, what they had accomplished. For 8 years, Boone had been Silas's faithful companion through isolation and grief. Now he had been witness to something that would reshape both their lives in ways neither of them could fully comprehend. Martha's photograph lay beside the central stone, unharmed by the cosmic forces that had raged around it. Silas picked it up with trembling hands, studying her face in the starlight. The image was unchanged, but somehow it seemed different now, not a reminder of loss, but a celebration of love that had proven stronger than death itself. She is not gone. None of the truly loved are ever gone. They live in the choices made by those who remember them. The hatchling's words carried a wisdom that went beyond its alien origin. Love, Silas realized, was perhaps the only truly universal force, recognized and valued by intelligent species across the cosmos, powerful enough to breach the barriers between life and death as dawn approached, painting the eastern sky in shades of gold and rose. Silas began to understand the magnitude of what had changed. The barrier would hold for generations, perhaps centuries, keeping the hunger that walks confined to the spaces between worlds. But the network of guardians had been awakened by his sacrifice, and others around the globe would now know their purpose. Your world is safe, but not unchanged. The awakening has been felt by those who have eyes to see. Some will seek you out looking for answers, and what will I tell them? The truth. That love is stronger than fear, that sacrifice freely given creates power beyond measure, and that every world faces the choice between connection and consumption. The sun crested the horizon, and in its light Silas could see the valley below. Smoke no longer rose from the supernatural fires that had consumed his cabin and the surrounding forest. In their place, new growth was already beginning to emerge, not the slow regeneration of natural forest succession, but something accelerated and guided by forces beyond normal understanding. Life, it seemed, was determined to reclaim what had been temporarily lost. The hatchlings began to glow more brightly as the sunlight touched them, their forms becoming translucent in the morning warmth. They were preparing to leave, their mission accomplished and their purpose fulfilled. We go now to spread the word. Other guardians must be awakened, other barriers strengthened. The hunger sleeps, but it does not die. Vigilance is the price of peace. Will I see you again? In time. When the need is great, the guardians call to each other across any distance. You are part of the network now, connected to protectors on 1,000 worlds. One by one, the creatures flowed from his jacket, their forms dissolving into points of light that scattered on the morning breeze. Within moments, they were gone, leaving only the memory of their alien wisdom and the knowledge that humanity was no longer alone in its struggle against the dark. Silas stood slowly, his body aching from the night's ordeal, but his spirit lighter than it had been in 20 years. The descent from Eagle's Rest would be easier in daylight, and he had much to consider about what came next. His cabin was gone, but the mountain remained. His old life was over, but a new purpose had taken its place. Boone trotted ahead on the trail, pausing occasionally to look back and make sure his human companion was following. The dog's natural optimism had reasserted itself now that the immediate danger was past, and his tail wagged with the simple joy of being alive to see another sunrise. As they descended toward the valley, Silas thought about the future. There would be questions from the authorities about the destroyed aircraft and the strange phenomena that had been detected throughout the region. There would be others seeking him out, both those who wanted to understand what had happened and those who might wish to exploit the knowledge he now carried. But there would also be purpose. For the first time since Martha's death, he had a reason to engage with the world beyond his mountain solitude. The network of guardians would need guidance, and the barriers would require maintenance. Most importantly, humanity would need to understand that it was part of something larger than itself, a cosmos, filled with wonders and terrors in equal measure. The man who had come to this mountain 20 years ago, seeking only peace, had become something more. He was a guardian now, a protector of the light, and the keeper of knowledge that might one day save not just his own world, but countless others. Some things, Silas reflected as he walked toward his uncertain future, were indeed worth dying for. And sometimes love proves strong enough to let you live for them instead.